I gave my last $10 to a stranger in a snowstorm, not knowing it would expose what my own family had been hiding from me for years. The wind that night cut through my coat like it wasn't even there, sharp and relentless, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and makes you question every decision that led you outside after dark. I remember standing at the edge of the gas station parking lot on Route 17, watching the snow come down in thick, heavy sheets, turning everything into a blur of white and silence. My old sedan had barely made it there, the fuel gauge hovering just above empty, the heater coughing out lukewarm air that did little to fight the chill. At 67, I had learned to be careful with what I had, every dollar, every mile, every ounce of energy. But that night, something about the way he stood there changed everything. He was near the entrance, just under the flickering fluorescent light, dressed in a coat that looked too thin for the weather, his hands bare, his shoulders stiff against the wind. Most people would have walked past him. Most people probably did. I almost did too. I told myself I couldn't afford to help anyone, not when I was counting quarters for groceries and cutting my pills in half to make them last longer. But then he looked at me. It wasn't desperation I saw, not exactly. It was something quieter, something that didn't beg but simply waited, like he had already accepted whatever answer the world would give him. I don't know why that mattered to me, but it did. I reached into my purse, fingers brushing against the worn leather wallet I'd carried for years, and opened it slowly, already knowing what I would find inside. $10. That was all I had left until the end of the week. $10 meant a loaf of bread, maybe a carton of eggs if they were on sale. $10 meant getting by. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of that choice settle over me heavier than the snow piling up on the pavement. Then I closed my eyes, just for a second, and thought about all the times I had told myself that kindness still mattered, that doing the right thing wasn't something you postponed until life got easier. When I opened my eyes again, I was already walking toward him. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely carrying over the wind. He turned slightly, and up close I noticed how calm he looked, how steady his gaze was despite the storm swirling around us. I held out the bill, my hand trembling from the cold. "You might need this more than I do." He didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he studied my face, as if trying to understand something deeper than the gesture itself. Then, slowly, he took the money, his fingers brushing mine for just a brief second. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but clear, the kind of voice that didn't belong to someone who was lost. There was something else in his tone, too, something I couldn't quite place at the time. Not surprise, not relief, something closer to recognition. I nodded, unsure of what else to say, and turned back toward my car before I could change my mind. As I drove away, the snow thickened, swallowing the road behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped into something I didn't fully understand. That night should have ended there, just another small act of kindness in a life full of quiet sacrifices. But it didn't, because a few days later, sitting at my son Daniel's dinner table, listening to his wife Rachel talk about things that were none of my business, I would hear a name that made my hands go still. And in that moment, I would realize that the man in the snowstorm wasn't a stranger at all, and that the $10 I thought I had given away might be the key to everything my family had been keeping from me. I had always believed that silence in a home meant peace, but over the past 2 years, I had begun to understand that silence could also mean something else entirely. It could mean distance. It could mean decisions being made without you. It could mean you were no longer part of the life you once built. After my husband passed, the house felt larger in a way that had nothing to do with its square footage. Every room seemed to echo just a little more, every clock tick a little louder. I kept things the way they had always been, his coat still hanging by the door, his coffee mug on the same shelf, as if preserving those small details might keep something from slipping away completely. Money had become tighter than I ever expected. We had planned carefully, or at least I thought we had, but there were gaps I did not understand. Bills arrived that seemed higher than they should have been, statements that did not quite match what I remembered. I learned to stretch everything. I measured groceries down to the last ounce, turned the thermostat lower than was comfortable, and told myself that making do was simply part of getting older. Daniel would call occasionally, always in a hurry, his voice distracted, as if he were speaking to me between more important tasks. He would ask if I was all right, and I would say yes, because it felt easier than explaining things I was not even sure how to put into words. Rachel rarely spoke to me directly, unless it was necessary. When she did, her tone was polite but distant, like someone addressing a neighbor rather than family. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself that life was busy, that people changed, that maybe I was expecting too much. Still, there were moments that stayed with me. Small things. The way conversations would pause when I entered the room during visits. The way Daniel would glance at Rachel before answering even the simplest question. The way certain topics seemed to close off the moment I showed interest, like doors quietly being shut. I noticed these things, but I did not confront them. I had spent most of my life keeping peace, smoothing over discomfort, choosing patience over conflict. It had always worked before, or at least I thought it had.
A few days after the storm, I drove over to Daniel's house for dinner. The roads were clear again, but the snow still lined the edges of the sidewalks in uneven gray piles. His house looked warm from the outside, lights glowing through the windows, everything appearing exactly as it should. Inside, the table was already set, Rachel moving between the kitchen and dining room with practiced efficiency. She greeted me with a brief smile, one that did not quite reach her eyes. Daniel hugged me quickly, his attention already drifting back toward whatever he had been doing before I arrived. We sat down, plates filled, the usual sounds of utensils and quiet conversation filling the space. I tried to focus on the normalcy of it, the comfort of routine, but something felt slightly off, like a note in a familiar song played just a little out of tune. Rachel began talking about finances, about investments, about decisions that sounded important but were explained in a way that kept me at a distance. I listened, nodding when it seemed appropriate, even though I did not fully understand why these things were being discussed in front of me, yet not with me. Then she said a name. It was casual, almost careless, slipped into the conversation as if it meant nothing at all. "Mr. Grant signed off on it," she said, reaching for her glass without looking up. My hand froze around my fork. The room did not change, not really. The lights stayed warm, the plates remained full. The conversation continued. But something inside me shifted, quiet and precise. I knew that name. I had heard it just days before, carried on the wind in the middle of a snowstorm, spoken in a voice that did not belong to a stranger. And in that moment, sitting at my son's table, I realized that whatever had happened that night had not been random, and whatever my family was discussing now was something they had never intended for me to understand. I did not react right away when I heard the name. I simply set my fork down beside my plate, careful not to make a sound, and took a small sip of water as if nothing had changed. Years of keeping peace had taught me that the most important moments were often the quietest ones, the ones where you listened instead of spoke. Rachel continued talking, her voice steady, confident, as if she were explaining something routine, something already decided. Daniel nodded along, barely glancing in my direction, his attention fixed on her in a way that felt practiced, almost automatic. "It has all been handled," she said, her tone light, almost dismissive. "Mr. Grant reviewed everything personally." Handled. The words settled heavily in my mind. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, something began to turn, slow and deliberate, like a key being fitted into a lock I had not realized was there. I thought about the envelopes that had never arrived, the statements that had seemed incomplete, the small inconsistencies I had dismissed as my own confusion. I thought about the way Daniel had stopped asking about my finances months ago, as if the subject no longer concerned him. I had told myself it was because he trusted me to manage on my own. Now, sitting there, I began to wonder if it was because he believed everything had already been taken care of. "What exactly has been handled?" I asked, keeping my voice soft, almost casual, as if I were only making conversation. Rachel paused for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she smiled, the same polite smile she always used when she wanted to redirect a situation. "Oh, just some paperwork from your late husband's accounts," she said. "Nothing you need to worry about." "Nothing you need to worry about." I repeated the phrase silently, letting it settle. My late husband's accounts. The words felt distant and close at the same time, like something I should recognize but could not fully grasp. Daniel finally looked at me then, but only briefly. "It is complicated stuff, Mom," he added, his tone gentle but firm. "We did not want to burden you with it." Burden me. I nodded slowly, as if I understood, as if I accepted the explanation, but inside a different feeling was taking shape, one I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. Awareness. I let the conversation move on without pressing further, but I paid attention now in a way I had not before. Every glance Rachel gave Daniel, every small pause before she answered, every moment where something was said without being fully explained. It was all there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed. After dinner, as Rachel cleared the plates and Daniel stepped into the living room to take a call, I remained seated for a moment longer, my hands resting lightly on the table. The house felt warm, comfortable, everything in its place, and yet I could not shake the feeling that I was sitting in a space where decisions had been made about my life without my knowledge. I stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen, offering to help, but Rachel waved me off with a quick shake of her head. "I have got it," she said, her back already turned to me. I lingered there for a moment, watching her move with quiet efficiency, then stepped away, giving her the space she seemed to prefer. In the hallway, I paused, my gaze drifting toward the small desk near the window, where a stack of mail sat neatly arranged. It was an ordinary sight, something I might have passed without a second thought on any other day, but now I found myself looking at it differently. I moved closer, slowly, as if I were not entirely sure what I was searching for. The top envelope was addressed to Daniel, the next to Rachel, both opened, both already handled. Beneath them, partially hidden, was another envelope. My name was printed on the front in clean, precise lettering, Margaret Collins. I stared at it for a moment, my fingers hovering just above the paper. Something about it felt important, though I could not yet say why. I reached out and picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hand. It was thicker than a typical letter, the kind that carried documents rather than words, and in the corner, printed in small, understated text, was a name I now recognized immediately, Grant Financial Services. The room seemed to grow quieter around me, the sounds of dishes and running water fading into the background. I turned the envelope over, my heart steady, my thoughts clearer than they had been in months. Whatever had been handled, whatever I was not supposed to worry about, it was no longer something I could ignore, because for the first time, I was beginning to understand that the gaps in my life were not accidents, they were choices, and someone had been making them for me. I did not open the envelope right away. Instead, I held it in my hands for a moment longer, feeling the weight of it, as if it carried more than just paper inside. The sound of running water from the kitchen continued behind me, steady and distant, and Daniel's voice drifted faintly from the living room as he spoke on the phone. Everything around me remained ordinary, unchanged, and yet nothing felt the same. I slipped the envelope quietly into my purse, my movements slow and deliberate, and walked back toward the dining room as if I had never left my seat. When Rachel turned off the faucet and stepped back into view, I was already standing near the coat rack, preparing to leave. "You are heading out already?" she asked, her tone polite, though there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, something I could not quite name. "It is getting late," I replied, offering a small smile. "The roads are still a little icy." Daniel ended his call and joined us, giving me a quick hug at the door. "Drive safe, Mom," he said, already half distracted again. I nodded, stepping out into the cold night air, the door closing softly behind me. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because of the distance, but because of the thoughts that filled the quiet space around me. Streetlights passed in slow intervals, their glow reflecting off patches of snow still clinging to the edges of the road. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my mind kept returning to the envelope resting in my purse, to the name printed in the corner, to the conversation I had just left behind. By the time I reached my driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it, dark except for the small porch light I always kept on. I sat in the car for a moment before turning off the engine, listening to the soft ticking sound as it cooled. For years, this house had been a place of certainty. Now, it felt like a place where I would finally have to start asking questions. Inside, I hung my coat carefully and placed my purse on the kitchen table. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet I had grown used to, but tonight it felt different, more focused, more aware. I pulled out the envelope and set it down in front of me, tracing the edge of it with my fingertips before finally opening it. The paper inside was thick, official, the kind used for documents meant to be taken seriously. I unfolded the first page slowly, my eyes moving across the lines one at a time, taking in each word without rushing. It did not take long for the meaning to settle in. There were transfers listed, amounts that made my breath catch slightly, dates that stretched back over the past 2 years, monthly deposits, regular, consistent, enough to have covered every bill, every expense I had struggled to manage, enough to have changed everything. My name was there, clearly printed, identified as the recipient. My address was correct. The account details were precise. Nothing about it looked like a mistake. I turned to the next page, then the next, each one confirming the same thing in a different way. Funds had been sent. Funds had been approved. Funds had been received. But not by me.
I lowered the papers onto the table, my hands resting lightly on top of them as I stared ahead, letting the realization settle fully into place. All those months of stretching groceries, of lowering the heat, of telling myself that this was simply how life was now. All those quiet reassurances that I was managing just fine. They had not been necessary. Somewhere along the way, something that was meant for me had been redirected, quietly and consistently, without a word. I thought back to the conversations I had had with Daniel, the way he had asked if I was comfortable, if I needed anything. I had said no, because I believed I had nothing coming, because I believed that what I had was all there was. And now, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I understood that belief had not been an accident. It had been built, piece by piece, by information I had never been given. I picked up the final page, my eyes drawn to a signature at the bottom. Edward Grant. The name no longer felt distant or unfamiliar. It felt connected, deliberate, part of something larger that had only just begun to reveal itself. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back into the envelope, not out of uncertainty, but out of control. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel confused. I did not feel lost. I felt something else entirely, clear. And as I sat there in the quiet of my home, I realized that whatever had been taken from me had not disappeared. It had been moved. And now that I knew where to start looking, I would not stop until I understood exactly how it had happened and who had decided it should. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had refused to settle. The envelope remained on the kitchen table where I had left it, undisturbed, as if it had been waiting for me to return to it with clearer eyes. I made coffee the way I always did, measuring it carefully, pouring it slowly, letting the routine steady my hands. For years, I had relied on these small habits to keep everything else in place. But as I sat down across from those documents again, I understood that routine alone was no longer enough. I spread the papers out one more time, this time paying closer attention to the details I had overlooked the night before. Account numbers, transaction dates, routing information. Everything was precise. Everything was documented. And yet something in the pattern began to stand out. The deposits had not simply disappeared. They had been redirected into a different account, one that was listed only by its last 4 digits. I stared at those numbers for a long moment, letting them settle in my memory. They felt familiar in a way I could not immediately explain. I stood up and walked toward the small filing cabinet in the corner of the living room, the one I had not opened in months. Inside were old statements, insurance papers, tax returns, all organized the way my husband had once insisted they should be. I flipped through them slowly, page by page, until I found what I was looking for. A joint account statement from years ago, back when everything had been simpler, clearer. My eyes moved to the bottom of the page, and there it was. The same last 4 digits, the same account. But that account had been closed after my husband passed. I remembered signing the paperwork myself, sitting across from a bank representative who had assured me that everything would be transferred into a new account under my name. I remembered Daniel being there that day, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, his voice calm as he said he would help me handle everything. I had trusted him. I had trusted both of them. I returned to the kitchen table, the realization settling deeper now. No longer a question, but a direction. If the account had been closed, then someone had reopened it. Or worse, someone had never closed it at all. And if the money had been going there, month after month, then someone had been receiving it. Quietly,
consistently, without ever telling me. I sat down again, my hands resting flat against the table, and allowed myself to think back over the past 2 years, not as a series of isolated moments, but as a pattern. The missed statements, the vague answers, the way Rachel had always been the one to step in when financial topics came up, the way Daniel had deferred to her without hesitation. It had not been random. It had been structured, intentional, a system designed to keep me comfortable enough not to question, but uncertain enough not to look too closely. I felt something shift inside me then, not sharp or overwhelming, but steady and certain. For a long time, I had told myself that misunderstandings happened, that families sometimes struggled to communicate, that it was better to assume good intentions. But this was not a misunderstanding. This was not silence born out of busyness or distraction. This was information being withheld. This was control, carefully maintained over time. I folded the papers again, more deliberately now, and placed them back into the envelope. Then I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a number I had not used in years. The bank branch where we had first opened our accounts, back when everything still felt like it belonged to both of us. My finger hovered over the screen for a moment before I pressed call. The line rang twice before a voice answered, polite and professional. I introduced myself, keeping my tone calm, measured, and asked a simple question. I provided the last 4 digits of the account and requested confirmation of its status. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of typing, then another pause, slightly longer this time. Yes, ma'am, the voice finally said. That account is still active. I closed my eyes briefly, not in shock, but in acknowledgement. Can you tell me who is authorized on it? Another pause. 1 moment, please. When the answer came, it was clear, direct, and exactly what I had expected, even if I had not wanted to hear it. I thanked them, ended the call, and set the phone down carefully beside the envelope. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt focused. Because now I was no longer wondering if something had been taken from me. I knew it had. And more importantly, I knew who had taken it. For a long time, I sat at that table without moving, letting the silence settle around me like a second skin. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply sat there, hands folded neatly in front of me, the way I had done through countless family dinners where I had chosen patience over confrontation. But this time, something was different. This time, the silence did not feel like weakness. It felt like control. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the thin layer of snow that still covered the yard, untouched and quiet. 2 years. That was how long it had been happening. 2 years of deposits I never saw. 2 years of decisions made in my name. 2 years of being gently guided away from the truth while believing I was being protected. I thought about Daniel, about the boy who used to run into my arms after school, who used to ask me for advice on everything, who used to believe that I had all the answers. Somewhere along the way, that boy had become a man who no longer asked questions, a man who accepted explanations without looking too closely. And Rachel, I allowed myself to think of her now, not as the polite woman who set the table and spoke in careful tones, but as someone who had been watching, calculating, deciding. The bank had confirmed what I already knew. Her name was on that account. Not mine, not ours, hers. The money that had been meant for me had been placed somewhere I could not reach, controlled by someone who had decided I did not need to know. I turned away from the window and walked back to the table, picking up the envelope once more. I did not feel anger the way I thought I would. I felt clarity. And with clarity came something else, a plan. I did not call Daniel. I did not drive back to their house. I did not confront Rachel with accusations or demand explanations. That would have been the version of me they expected, the one who reacted emotionally, who could be dismissed, redirected, managed. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I prepared quietly. I spent the rest of the morning gathering everything I had, old statements, letters, documents I had not looked at in years. I laid them out across the table, creating a timeline, piece by piece, matching dates, comparing details, filling in the gaps they had left behind. The pattern became clearer with every page. This had not started by accident. It had been set in motion deliberately, carefully, with just enough distance to avoid suspicion. By the afternoon, I knew enough to take the next step.
I picked up the phone again, this time dialing a different number. The office listed at the top of the documents, Grant Financial Services. The line connected quickly, and a receptionist answered in a calm, professional tone. I gave my name, steady and clear, and asked if Mr. Edward Grant was available. There was a brief pause, then a shift in her voice, something more attentive, more precise. "May I ask what this is regarding?" she said. I looked down at the paper spread across my table, at my name printed again and again where it had been ignored for so long. "He will understand," I replied simply. Another pause. Then, "Please hold." The seconds that followed were quiet but heavy, each one stretching just enough to remind me that this moment mattered. When the line clicked again, the voice that came through was familiar in a way that made everything fall into place. Calm, steady, the same voice that had thanked me in the cold, as if he had already known something I did not. "Margaret Collins," he said, as if my name had never been a question. I did not ask how he recognized it. I did not ask why he remembered. Some answers did not need to be spoken. "Yes," I said. There was a brief silence on the line, not uncomfortable, but deliberate. Then he spoke again, his tone measured, certain. "I was hoping you would call." I closed my eyes for just a moment, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement. Because in that moment, I understood that whatever had been happening behind my back, whatever had been taken, whatever had been hidden, I was no longer the only one who could see it. And this time, I would not be left out of the conversation. I did not rush to speak after he said that. I let the silence sit between us for a moment, the kind of silence that reveals more than words ever could. On the other end of the line, I could hear nothing but the faint hum of distance, steady and patient, as if he was giving me the time to understand exactly where I stood now. "You know why I am calling," I said finally, my voice calm, even. It was not a question. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "I believe I do." There was no surprise in his tone, no confusion, only a quiet certainty that made everything feel more real than I had expected. I glanced down at the documents spread across my table, my name repeated over and over again on pages that had never reached me. "The funds," I said, choosing each word carefully. "They were meant for me." "They were," he confirmed. "Every transfer was authorized with you as the intended recipient." Intended. The word carried weight, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding myself in the moment. "But they did not reach me," I continued. Another pause, longer this time, as if he were considering how much to say. "No," he said at last. "They did not." I closed my eyes briefly, not out of shock, but out of recognition. The truth had already taken shape in my mind. This was simply the final piece settling into place. "The account," I said. "It is not in my name." "No," he replied again, his tone unchanged. "It was redirected shortly after your husband passed. The authorization documents were submitted with your son present." I opened my eyes slowly, focusing on a single point on the table, letting the words sink in without reacting to them immediately. Daniel had been there. Of course he had. I remembered that day clearly now, the way he had stood beside me at the bank, the way he had reassured me that everything would be handled properly, that I did not need to worry about the details. I had believed him. "And Rachel?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. There was a slight shift on the line, not hesitation, but acknowledgement. "She is the primary account holder," he said. I nodded to myself, even though he could not see it. It was exactly what I had expected, and yet hearing it spoken out loud carried a different kind of finality. "Why did you not contact me directly?" I asked. It was the one question that still lingered, the one piece I needed to understand. This time he did not answer immediately. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "Because I was given reason to believe that you were aware," he said. "All communications were directed through your son and his wife. There were confirmations, signatures, follow-ups. Nothing indicated otherwise."
I let out a slow breath, not in frustration, but in acceptance of how carefully everything had been arranged. "Until now," I said. "Until now," he agreed. Another brief silence passed between us, but this one felt different, not empty, but aligned. "There is something else," he added, his tone shifting slightly, as if he were stepping into a different part of the conversation. "The night we met." My hand tightened slightly against the table, though my voice remained calm. "You recognized me." "Yes," he said simply. "I had seen your name many times before. I just did not expect to meet you like that." I thought back to that night, to the snow, to the quiet way he had looked at me, as if he had already understood something I had not yet realized. "You did not say anything," I said. "No," he replied, "because I needed to be certain." I understood then, not just what had happened, but how long it had been unfolding without my knowledge. "And now?" I asked. His answer came without hesitation. "Now, I believe you deserve to know everything." I sat back slightly, my gaze steady, my thoughts clear. Because this was no longer about confusion or suspicion. This was about truth. And for the first time in a long while, I was no longer the last person to hear it.
I did not ask him to explain everything over the phone. Some truths deserved more than a voice carried through a line, and some conversations required presence, not distance. Instead, I listened as he outlined what he could, his words measured, precise, each one adding weight to what I already knew. There had been documents filed in my name that I had never seen, confirmations sent that I had never received, decisions approved that I had never agreed to. And yet, on paper, everything appeared proper, complete, unquestionable. When the call ended, I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt organized. That afternoon, I placed every document back into the envelope, then into a folder, aligning each page carefully, as if restoring order to something that had been quietly dismantled. I dressed the next morning with the same attention to detail, choosing a simple coat, smoothing my hair, making sure everything about me reflected calm rather than conflict. By the time I stepped outside, the air had softened, the snow beginning to melt at the edges, leaving behind a world that looked unchanged, but felt entirely different. I did not call ahead. I did not announce my visit. When I arrived at Daniel's house, the driveway was clear, the front windows glowing with the same warmth they always had. From the outside, nothing had shifted. I knocked once, then waited. Rachel opened the door, her expression settling into polite surprise the moment she saw me. "Margaret," she said, her voice carefully balanced between welcome and uncertainty. "I was not expecting you." "I know," I replied gently. "I thought I would stop by." She stepped aside, allowing in, her movements smooth but slightly delayed, as if adjusting to a situation she had not prepared for. Inside, everything is in place, the same furniture, the same arrangement, the same sense of order that had once made me feel like I belonged. Now I saw it differently. Daniel appeared from the hallway, his face brightening briefly before settling into something more cautious. "Mom, is everything okay?" he asked. I nodded, removing my gloves slowly. "Everything is fine," I said. And it was, in a way, because now I understood it. We moved into the dining room, the same table, the same chairs, the same setting where conversations had once passed over me without question. I took my seat without being asked, placing my purse gently beside me. Rachel remained standing for a moment before joining us, her posture composed, her eyes watching more closely than before. Daniel sat across from me, his hands resting on the table, waiting. I did not begin with accusations. I did not raise my voice. Instead, I reached into my purse and took out the envelope, placing it carefully in the center of the table. Neither of them touched it. "I found this," I said, my tone even, my gaze steady. Rachel's eyes flickered briefly to the envelope, then back to me, her expression unchanged, but her stillness more pronounced. Daniel looked at it, then at me, confusion forming slowly. "What is it?" he asked. I did not answer right away. Instead, I opened the envelope, removing the documents one by one and laying them out in front of them, aligning each page as I had done before. The room grew quieter with each movement, the kind of quiet that did not need to be acknowledged to be understood.
"These are transfers," I said finally. "Monthly, for the past 2 years." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brow tightening as he began to read. Rachel did not move. She did not reach for the papers. She simply watched, her eyes moving between me and the documents, as if calculating the space between what was known and what could still be denied. "They were sent to me," I continued, "but they did not arrive." Daniel looked up then, his expression shifting from confusion to something else, something less certain. "Mom, I do not understand," he said. I met his gaze calmly. "No," I said softly, "you do not." And then, for the first time, I turned my attention fully to Rachel, holding her gaze without hesitation, without anger, without raising my voice. "But she does."
For a moment, no one spoke. The air in the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that made everything feel sharper, more defined. Daniel looked between us, his confusion deepening, his eyes searching for something that still made sense. Rachel, however, remained still, not surprised, not offended, just still. That was the first thing I noticed. Not denial, not outrage, just calculation. "Rachel?" Daniel said, his voice uncertain now, no longer steady. She did not answer him right away. Instead, she reached forward slowly and picked up the top document, her fingers careful, controlled, as if she were handling something fragile rather than something that could unravel everything. Her eyes moved across the page quickly, then more slowly, as if confirming what she already knew was there. When she finally looked up, her expression had not changed. "This is a misunderstanding," she said calmly. The words were smooth, practiced, the kind that had likely worked before. I watched her, not interrupting, not reacting. "These accounts were consolidated," she continued, her tone measured. "It was more efficient this way. Daniel and I agreed it would be easier to manage everything together." Daniel blinked, turning toward her. "We did?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She glanced at him briefly, just enough to steady him, just enough to keep him from asking too much too quickly. "You remember," she said softly, "after your father passed, there was so much paperwork, we handled it." I let the silence stretch again, giving her the space to speak, to build her explanation, to reveal exactly how much she believed could still be controlled. Then I spoke, my voice as calm as it had been from the beginning. "The account is in your name," I said. Not a question, a statement. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, there was a flicker, small, brief, but there. "Yes," she said, "for administrative purposes." Administrative purposes. I repeated the phrase in my mind, the same way I had repeated others before. Words designed to sound reasonable, to soften what they were hiding. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression no longer just confused, but unsettled. "Why would it be in your name?" he asked, looking at her more closely now. She hesitated, just for a second. But this time, it was enough. "It simplified things," she said, though her voice had lost a fraction of her certainty. I reached into the envelope once more and placed the final page on the table, the one with the signature at the bottom. "Mr. Grant confirmed everything," I said quietly. "Every transfer, every authorization." Rachel's gaze dropped to the page, then lifted again. But this time, she did not speak immediately. Daniel followed my movement, his eyes scanning the document, stopping when he saw the totals, the dates, the consistency of it all. His face changed then, slowly, as understanding replaced confusion. "Mom never got this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I did not answer him. I did not need to. The papers in front of him spoke clearly enough. He turned back to Rachel, his expression no longer uncertain, but searching, as if he were seeing something for the first time that had been there all along. "Rachel?" he said again. This time there was no softness in his voice. She sat back slightly, her posture still composed, but the space around her felt different now, less controlled, less certain. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, her gaze shifting briefly away before returning to the table. I watched them both, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. For years I had believed that keeping peace meant staying quiet, that trust meant not asking questions, that family meant accepting what was given without looking too closely. But sitting there now, I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before. Silence does not protect you. It only protects what is being hidden. I stood up slowly,
gathering the documents with the same care I had used to lay them out. Neither of them stopped me. Neither of them spoke. At the door, I paused for just a moment, not to wait, but to acknowledge the space I was leaving behind. "I will be handling this from here," I said, my voice steady, final. Then I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me, the sound quiet but complete. The air felt different this time. Not colder, not warmer, just clear. And as I walked toward my car, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was no longer trying to understand what had been done to me. I already did. Now, I was simply deciding what would happen next.